Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webcast for the California Alternate Assessment for Science. My name is Dan Stanley, and I am Program Manager for the California Alternate Assessments with Educational Testing Service.
And I'm Linda Hooper, Administrator of the Science Office at the CDE.
And today, Linda and I are going to be covering the test administration for this year's CAA for Science. So, by the end of this webcast, we hope that you all will understand the purpose of the CAA for Science and how this assessment has been updated from last year, the steps you should take to prepare for this year's assessment, considerations for scheduling the CAA for Science, and considerations for how to train your test examiners to administer this year's tests. Here's the agenda. So in this webcast, we will cover some background information on the CAA for Science, just to give you a refresher on what the assessment is. We'll talk about a brand new planning resource that's called the Administration Planning Guide. We'll go through the step-by-step sequence of how an embedded performance task, or embedded PT, is administered, test security procedures, checklists, reporting and tracking, and some training resources that we developed this year that should really help you as you kick off testing this year. At the end of this session, we will have a question and answer period. So please look at the bottom of your screen as you're viewing, and as Linda and I are talking, you can type questions in at any point during our presentation. And then at the end, we'll take some time to answer as many of your questions that we can, given the time allotted. But I promise that someone will follow up with you regardless. If we don't get to your question, someone will follow up shortly after the webcast.
Okay, so as we're developing the CAA for Science, we had several goals. One is to provide meaningful information to both students and educators, support and promote educators' implementation of the California Next Generation Science Standards, to embed the assessment into the instructional practices of the California Next Generation Science Standards, and to offer developmentally appropriate opportunity for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities to be assessed. So how did we get there? In March of 2013, the State Board of Education adopted the California Next Generation Science Standards. In July of 2016, the State Board of Education adopted the high-level test design for the California Alternate Assessment for Science. We wanted to approach the development of the assessment in a very deliberate fashion, and so we had 2 years of pilot testing. The first year was in 2017, and the second year was last year, the 2017-18 school year. And we are going to field test this year, starting for the 2018-19 school year, starting in January of 2019. And we will be operational starting September 2019 through July of 2020. So let's go over what's new for the 2018-19 administration of the California Alternate Assessment for Science. So as the test was administered last year, and for the second year pilot, there will be 3 performance tasks that each student will be required to take. Each embedded performance task will cover Earth and space science, life sciences, and physical sciences. Remember that all 3 embedded performance tasks must be attempted in order for the student to be counted as participating. And, oh, that's mine too. So I'm going to give you a graphic, and this graphic kind of outlines the layout of a performance task. Now, the graphic only shows one part or one half of the performance task, so I just wanted to make that clear. And now we are we're providing an orienting activity, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail throughout this presentation, but we have this orienting activity. Then the student is given item 1, and at that point we have a student response check. So if the student does not I want to say engage,
Orient.
but orient to that item, then we can, the test examiner can stop the test. We would then, if they do orient to the test, you can administer the following items. Now, just to be clear that this is only one half of the performance task. You would go through another orienting activity and you would have 5 additional questions. The only difference is that you would not have that opportunity to stop the test at that point in time.
So like the CAAs for ELA and mathematics tests, test examiners will use grade and version-specific directions for administration, or DFAs. That's a change this year. In that sense, the test does work more like the ELA and math test than it did last year. DFAs are all important. You'll hear Linda and I talk about them a lot during this presentation. But essentially, they guide test examiners step by step through the testing process for each embedded performance task. New this year, each PT will have 2 orienting activities. The orienting activity is a non-scorable activity that is designed to engage and familiarize students to science concepts that they were taught previously. The purpose of the orienting activity is to re-engage the student with the science content prior to giving the test questions that go with the activity. And you'll hear us talk a lot about the orienting activity because it is new this year. In fact, the next slide has got some more on it. So let's talk a bit more about the orienting activity. It can come in different forms. It can be a video that is delivered through the test delivery system, meaning the test examiner doesn't need to do anything. They just need to play the video. But it can also come in the form of a hands-on activity that's administered using materials that are regularly found in the classroom. Or it can be a hands-on activity using materials that are actually provided in that DFA document that I mentioned. They'll be at the end of the document. The orienting activity may be individualized to best meet the needs of the student. I know that word individualize is new. We're going to talk a lot more about that as well later in this presentation. Okay, so Linda and I just went through a lot of information very quickly. That was just an overview. We're going to spend a lot more time going through each of those things that we talked about. First, let's go into a little bit of background on what is the CAA for Science, for those of you that are not familiar with the assessment. The CAA for Science is designed for students that have the most significant cognitive disabilities, students whose IEP teams designate the use of alternate assessments. Those students are eligible to take the CAA for Science. The CAA for Science only applies to grades 5, 8, and then once in grade 10, 11, or 12, meaning a student takes it in just one of those grades, 10, 11, or 12.
Okay, so last year we started keeping track, banking basically the students' participation and their scores from 2018, from 2017-18. Again, Dan said that the grades tested for high school are grade 10, 11, or 12. So we're banking the items that are banking the participation and scores from last year's second-year pilot. For example, an 11th grader who took the test last year cannot be registered to take the test this year in the Test Operations Management System, or TOMS. This means that students who repeat grade 12 for multiple years will not have to retest. One other thing is that CalPADS is no longer supporting ungraded secondary, which means that the districts need to assign a grade to those students that were previously ungraded secondary, which means you may have to test students if you are assigning a grade 12 to that student. They would have to take the assessment as a grade 12 student. All students in high school must take the test by their grade 12 year.
So as noted before, this year's CAA for Science will comprise 3 embedded performance tasks like last year, and they're designed to be incorporated into the instructional calendar, which is a very important point. We'll come back to that when we talk about scheduling. Each embedded performance task assesses 2 science connectors this year, and each embedded performance task has 10 test questions. Like Linda was showing you on that prior slide, it showed half of one performance task, but there's 10 questions in total in each embedded PT. Each embedded PT has 2 orienting activities. Each of those correspond to 5 test questions that come right after that orienting activity. Like I mentioned, some orienting activities will contain hands-on exercises to be completed with the student during testing. Individualization is allowed on certain items, and the DFA will give you more information about when individualization is permitted and in what form it can take.
And also wanted to remind you that all 3 embedded performance tasks must be attempted in order for the student to count as participating in the assessment.
The CAA for Science is administered one-on-one, like all the alternate assessments in California, so it's only ever 1 test examiner and 1 student in a specific testing session. This year, each embedded PT is online and may be accessed via the secure browser. A major feature of the test is the orienting activity. It is what makes this really a unique assessment and very different from the ELA and math tests. Test examiners may need to prepare materials for the activity before testing day. And just a reminder on the definition of the orienting activity, it's an activity that engages students to the concepts being tested in the items that will come right after it. So the 3 embedded performance tasks can be given in any order at any time when they're available. And the availability for this 18-19 administration is anytime between January 8th, 2019 through the end of your school's instructional calendar, or July 15th if your school happens to go past that date. Each performance task may be accessed online in the same test delivery system that's used for all the CAASPP assessments, and you can start administering embedded performance tasks anytime after January 8th. We're really going to emphasize that point because we're hoping that you will take advantage of this availability so you can really map testing with your instructional calendar. It's important to note that the CAA for Science testing window is not like the Smarter Balance testing window or the CAA for ELA and math testing window in that any of the 3 performance tasks can be given within the time period and they can be given in any order. After logging into a performance task in the test delivery system, the performance task will expire from a system perspective in 45 calendar days. So that would be important to note in cases, if a student took an extended leave after starting that task, just be aware that the system will close it down automatically after 45 days. Test site coordinators should work with other folks in your school and district as appropriate on scheduling. We'll talk a lot more about scheduling. We're asking you to think of it in a different way for this assessment than what's typically done for other CAASPP assessments. To aid in scheduling, we've developed a brand new tool called the Administration Planning Guide, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide.
So, like Dan said, we're feverishly working on this administration planning guide to aid and provide you with some guidance on when is it best to administer the embedded performance task through the school year. This is an especially useful tool to share with your educators, as this will guide information on the CAA for Science connectors that will be assessed this year. Some answers to the questions your educators may have about this year's test, as well as a planning schedule table that will give your educators a framework to start thinking about the test. Please share this information with your educators and administrators right away, and this will be available on the CAA webpage at CAASPP.org.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what we're hoping you all can do this year with the CAA for Science. test site coordinator specifically, we're asking you to work with your test examiners earlier in the year than typical, so that you can schedule the administration of each of the 3 performance tasks. We recommend that test site coordinators distribute the administration planning guide that Linda just talked about to test examiners as early as January, or really as soon as we have that available. We are finalizing that now, and we hope to announce its availability in the next few weeks. As soon as you get it, feel free to share it with everyone that's involved with testing, and we really think it'll be a helpful tool to answer all your questions about how to schedule the embedded PTs. Something new to consider is that now a school site will need to access the proper technology 3 times during the year for each of the performance tasks. And it's the same technology that you're used to setting up for the CAAs for ELA and mathematics, but you'll now need to have that available to them over a larger time period, so they have the flexibility to give the embedded performance task when it's most appropriate. Just a reminder that the testing system does require 2 internet-connected devices, one for the student testing and the other for the test examiner. And together, that constitutes the test delivery system, or TDS. As with all CAASPP tests, the student testing device should have the secure browser installed on it. So in summary, we're asking you to have that set up and in place for your test examiners sooner, so they can take advantage of the availability starting January 8th. A test examiner, okay, so that was it for the site coordinator. Now let's talk about the test examiner and some changes in setup for the CA for Science this year. We're asking that the test examiners collaborate with their site coordinators earlier in the year about when to administer each of the 3 performance tasks in a manner that matches the planned curriculum, the science curriculum that's being taught. Our hope is the embedded PTs can be embedded within that curriculum during the school year. A test examiner should review the administration planning guide as early as possible. As the test will be online this year, the test examiner should know that the test will be accessed the same way as the CAAs for ELA and math tests are accessed using TDS. So please let them know as soon as possible about that key change from last year. I think that test examiners that have been giving CA for Science over the last few years are used to it being different than ELA and math, but now the actual test questions are given in the same system as the ELA and math tests. So we recommend the test examiner download and review the DFA, the Directions for Administration, from TOMS, typically a couple of days before testing day for a specific embedded PT. We don't want them downloading it any sooner than necessary for test security reasons. We'll go more into that. But they do need to do it sooner than test day so they can read it and prepare for testing. Also, the test examiner, by reading that DFA prior with their students in mind, they can think about if it's appropriate to do individualization, which we'll talk about more as well. We do have some good news for you all. For those who were not big fans of the answer recording documents last year, those have gone away. With our move to the online testing, there's no longer a need for you to be tracking that additional piece of paper. There is no more answer recording document starting this year. So let's now go step by step through the process of how one embedded performance task is administered. And hopefully this graphic will help as we explain this process. So this graphic aims to represent the key components of an embedded performance task. Each embedded PT has the DFA that you've heard us mention already a few times. That's really a critical starting point for any embedded PT. It'll guide test examiners through every aspect of what they need to do to prepare for and then actually administer on test day the embedded PT. The embedded PT will have 2 orienting activities that are explained within the DFA, and those orienting activities, again, are intended to engage the student with the science concepts that they're about to be tested on. Each activity will be followed by 5 test questions that correspond to that specific orienting activity. So you heard Linda mention earlier about the student response check. The first test question that appears on screen of each embedded PT is what we want you to use as the student response check. So the purpose of the student response check is to confirm that the student will have a consistent and observable way of indicating responses 2 test questions, and that they can orient to the task. It is a little bit different than how it's done for ELA and math. You're going to hear us talk more about how the student response check works for science. After all the test questions are administered, there is a short 3-question survey for test examiners to answer. It'll appear automatically in the test delivery system once you've completed the last test question. And I want to emphasize that the survey is for the test examiner to answer, not for the student to answer. But the questions will be about the student's engagement with that performance task, and also is going to ask you questions about whether and how you individualized any part of that performance task. So let's go into a little more focus on the DFA document, the Directions for Administration. So this is a document that is test content. It is secure, and like I mentioned prior, the test examiner needs to have it on hand for testing and even prior to testing so that they can prepare. Each DFA is downloaded from TOMS. The TOMS system is a secure, password-protected system. And that's where we house electronic copies of the DFAs. So they can be downloaded from TOMS, which is similar to the ELA and math tests. Each school in California will be assigned either version 1 or version 2. Before testing, test examiners should know which version their school is assigned. Version assignments are posted or will be posted soon on the About the CAA webpage on CAASPP.org. So go there in order to find out what the assignment is for any school in California. If you do not find the version assignment for a specific school, don't worry. Any schools that aren't listed automatically default to version 1. So typically a few days before you're scheduled to administer one of the embedded performance tasks, the test examiner should download the secure DFA document from TOMS. They can be accessed from the sidebar, as you see on the screen here, from the Secure Materials button. I'm happy to say that we've made this interface more intuitive than in prior years. For those of you who are used to downloading ELA and math DFAs, it was a little less intuitive than it is now. Hopefully you'll find it easier to find these documents once you log into TOMS. Remember, the DFAs are secure. You'll hear us say this over and over. It's really critical that whether you use the DFAs in electronic or print format, that the DFAs are kept secure at all times. And as soon as you're done administering a performance task, they should be securely destroyed. The DFAs should be downloaded one at a time. Like we said earlier, only download them when you're getting ready to test within the next day or two. Just enough time to prepare for giving that embedded PT, but no earlier. We don't want schools and districts downloading all the DFAs at once. We really want them accessed only as needed for each individual performance task. One thing I want to note, because they're secure, you can use them electronically, but please do not send them by email. Before testing, make sure you have the right DFA. When you log into TOMS, you'll see there's multiple DFAs by version, by grade, and by each performance task. So make sure you have the right version, the right grade, and the right specific performance task that you want to administer. So now let's go over the step-by-step sequence of testing that occurs for one embedded performance task. It's really important to note that this graphic applies to just one embedded PT. Remember that your test examiners are going to be doing this 3 times for every student. First, a few days before testing, the test examiner downloads the DFA from TOMS that we talked about. The test examiner needs to review that DFA from beginning to end, especially if they're not familiar with it already, to prepare materials for both orienting activities as necessary for how the orienting activity is described in the DFA, and to think about individualization, which we'll talk more about. The next step after that's been completed is to have the testing system in place, the 2 devices that you see on screen, one for test examiner, one for student, and then to log in to the specific student test session on the student testing device. The next step after login is to administer the first orienting activity according to the directions in the DFA, after which the first test question can be administered to the student. With the first test question, this is where the student response check comes in, and this is where the test examiner will confirm that the student will provide a consistent and observable response. It's really important, though, for the test examiner who knows the student well to factor in what they know about the student and how the student engages or orients with the orienting activity before the first test question, because based on that orientation, we encourage the test examiner maybe to go on to the next few questions, even if the student doesn't give a response on the first question. So once that's done, the test examiner administers the rest of the first 5 questions. Then they'll be prompted to give the second orienting activity. After this, the last 5 test questions of the embedded performance task are administered. Once testing is concluded, test examiners will select the In-Test button in the test delivery system, and that will prompt the system to present the survey questions, the 3 survey questions that the test examiner will answer about the student's engagement with the embedded PT. And just to emphasize, those survey questions appear in the same system as the student testing device where the test questions appear. We'll go over each of these elements in more detail in the next few slides.
Thanks, Dan. So this is a different way to talk about what we've just been talking about. So you download the DFA, you review, so we're missing some steps here. You review the DFA, you get your materials together that you need. You determine whether you're going to individualize for that particular student. Once you are ready to administer the test, you log into the test delivery system. You administer the orienting activity. At that point in time, you start with question number 1, and at that point, you decide if the student is providing a response. So you can either proceed through the next 5 questions or stop the test. If you proceed through the 5 questions, then you would go to the second orienting activity, and then the remaining 5 questions, and then at the completion, you would then the test examiners would complete the survey for the student, about the student.
Okay, and now let us talk a little bit more about the orienting activities. You're hearing a lot about these from us, and it really is because they're so critical and because they are new this year. This slide shows you the 3 different modes for how the orienting activity might be presented in a particular embedded performance task. The orienting activity, again, introduces the concepts covered in the next 5 test questions. So it's not scored, but it is something that the test examiner must complete with the student before they proceed into the test questions after the orienting activity. And the purpose is to engage the student in that concept before testing starts. The first activity is administered after logging on to the test delivery system, and the second activity is administered after the first 5 test questions have been completed. So the orienting activity can be any of these 3 things on screen. It can be a video in the test delivery system where the test examiner just needs to make sure the student is able to see that video. The test examiner manages the speed. You can control the speed of the video, but there's no other materials to prepare in that case, typically. Or it can be in the form of a hands-on activity using graphics provided in the directions for administration. At the end of the DFA document, you'll find those graphics if they're part of the embedded PT. Or the third mode of orienting activity could be a hands-on activity using commonly found objects in the classroom. One of the refinements we've made this year is we really have tried to narrow it down to just the simplest, most common objects. We're not expecting teachers to have to buy anything or anything that wouldn't be commonly found. So hopefully you'll find it simpler to set up this year for the tasks where we do have the hands-on activities. The orienting activity can be individualized according to student needs. And the DFA will have specific instructions on what can be individualized, and we'll talk more about that process shortly. So now let's talk a little bit more about the student response check. The purpose of the SRC is to confirm that the student has a consistent and observable way of indicating responses to the test examiner for the test questions, and that they are orienting to the task. Typically, the test examiner should already know the student's response mode before testing. Test examiners should be familiar with the student and should establish what that response mode will be prior to testing. For example, will the student use verbal responses? Are they able to interact directly with the computer? Will they need to use eye gaze? Those things should be known before testing. The student response check is conducted using the first test question in every embedded PT, so the first of the 10 questions. If the student does not orient or respond after the first test question, the test examiner can end the test early at that point, and there is an end test button that appears on test question 1 for that purpose. The test examiners are responsible for following the directions very closely in the DFA for the student response check. And we want to emphasize, teachers know their students best, and they really need to make a distinction for their students between a student that's not orienting, engaging, perhaps to the specific question, test question 1, but they did orient to the orienting activity. They really need to give the student the benefit of the doubt and continue to the next few questions and give the student a chance to respond a couple more times. So really depending on the teacher's knowledge of the student. After all the test questions in the embedded performance task are administered, the test examiner will answer that short 3-question survey we mentioned. It will appear in the student testing device after the in-test button has been selected, and it does appear 3 times, once for each of the performance tasks given to a student. And again, the questions there are about the student's engagement with the performance task and whether or not the test examiner took advantage of opportunities to individualize any parts of that performance task.
So you've heard us talk a lot about individualization. What does it mean? If you've administered the test last year, you may be familiar with it, but let's go over what it is. Individualization is the process of adapting the orienting activity or an item to meet individual student needs based on the educator's knowledge of the student. In some cases, test examiners may individualize orienting activities and items. Each student has a unique way of orienting to an activity. Students should be presented with test material in the same way they are presented with the instructional material without changing the construct being assessed. The DFA will have instructions on what can and cannot be individualized. We are also working on getting some additional resources to further explain the process of individualization.
So 2 questions to consider, or to have your test examiners consider when they think about individualization, is what will best meet the needs of that specific student, and how do I typically instruct that specific student in the classroom? So those are 2 sort of key guiding questions for test examiners to consider. It really is to meet individual student needs and hopefully help some of those students that have a hard time engaging with the CAA for Science to increase the chances that they will be able to engage with the performance task. So next, let's go through some examples here on what individualization could actually look like in a specific example. So test examiners can individualize either the orienting activity or some items, like Linda said, so it does apply to both situations, and it's to meet the needs of the student. The DFA really has all the guidelines you need for individualization, when it is permitted, and if so, what it can consist of. So in this example on screen, the orienting activity may be a video that shows a cotton ball and a penny, right? So, and it's going to categorize each object as either having a hard property or a soft property. So this is an orienting activity that's being presented as a video, and that should be sufficient, hopefully, for most students. However, the DFA gives some options for individualizing. Perhaps the student doesn't engage well with videos, and perhaps it would be helpful for them to actually see this scientific phenomenon demonstrated using realia, using actual cotton balls and a penny. So the DFA will provide guidelines for obtaining the actual objects that might work and to guide the test examiner through demonstrating that scientific phenomenon in real life rather than just the video. So this is an example of individualization for an orienting activity. All right, let's now change gears and go through test security, specifically as it applies to the CAA for Science. Remember to follow the same security guidelines that are used for any of the CAASPP summative assessments. All LEA CAASPP coordinators, test site coordinators, and test examiners must sign the CAASPP test security affidavit before doing anything related to the CAA for Science. Information about items, including DFA content, should not be shared with anyone who is not directly responsible for test administration. DFAs and any print-on-demand materials must be securely handled during the test administration and must be securely destroyed after testing. For example, like we mentioned earlier, DFAs, even in electronic form, must be carefully monitored and kept secure at all times. They should never be emailed. Directions for administration need to be permanently destroyed, so not just dropped in the recycling bin. You need to empty them out of the recycling bin to make sure it's permanently removed from any device that it's been downloaded to. Test site coordinators are ultimately responsible for making sure all secure content, in the DFAs in particular, are collected and securely destroyed. Any printed copies should be shredded. Any digital copies should be permanently deleted, like I just mentioned. We've heard from LEAs over the years that have handled DFAs for ELA and math. There are different approaches to how you might track DFAs to make sure they're kept secure at all times. One method is perhaps to label each and every DFA with a number so that each document is traceable and trackable to help you make sure you're tracking each printed copy of the DFA. Let's spend just a moment talking about checklists that are required for the CAA for Science. They're not yet launched, but they will be available soon. Be sure to check out the online test administration manual for CAASPP testing. That's where you'll find all the checklists. They are role specific. You'll find checklists that are specifically tailored for LEA CAASPP coordinators, for test site coordinators, and for test examiners. These checklists not only list the things that need to be done, but also give you the timeline for the timing of each of those activities for when they should be completed leading up to test day.
So let's talk about tracking and reporting. So we've made some changes to the tracking and reporting to tracking. So first of all, you can use the online reporting system to track students' progress through each performance task. That's kind of cumbersome at times because there's no way to know when a student has completed all 3 performance tasks. So in April, we are going to be launching a downloadable report in TOMS that will be able to track students' completion for all 3 performance tasks. This will allow coordinators to see when students have completed, like I said, all 3 of the performance tasks. So you've got two methods. One, you can check each performance task individually through the online reporting system, or in April when we launch this new report, it will provide you with a report with all 3 performance tasks listed and whether the student has taken them or not.
Absolutely. And if I could jump in just to emphasize that, we really want to help you track to make sure every student has completed all 3 PTs. So that's where that tool comes in. We really are hoping it'll help you make sure that no student doesn't get counted as participated because they missed their 3rd PT. We really want to make sure that every student is completing the requirement for CAA for Science.
Thanks, Dan. So reporting. This next year, the 2018-19 school year, is our field test year, and we are going to be reporting preliminary indicators again. However, the preliminary indicator percent correct and indicator category levels will be provided in the student downloadable file, and that will be available sometime in the fall. So again, we'll instead of having to manually calculate the scores like you do this year, next year it will be part of the student downloadable file.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the available training resources for the CAA for Science. This slide lists the really critical materials that are available to you to help you in your LEA and in your schools to train up your test examiners. The administration planning guide, you heard us talk about that multiple times already. We really think this is going to be a very helpful tool. It's brand new this year. We didn't have it last year. It'll be out very soon in the coming week or two. And it'll really be your first stop, I think, to get started, to figure out how you need to schedule the embedded PTs over the time period between January and the end of your instructional calendar. The online CAA for Science training test is also a highly recommended tool. This is the counterpart to training tests on other CAASPP assessments. It will also be available in the very, very near future. And it'll be in the exact same format as the new online operational tests. So, we've been talking throughout this presentation about the changes this year, how the questions are now online. The training performance task is going to show you that new format, so help you, your test examiners, and students become familiar with the new format of the CAA for Science. The test examiner tutorial is a mandatory online module that a test examiner must complete before administering the CAA for Science or the CAAs for ELA and Math. And it can be helpful for really anybody closely involved with testing. We encourage LEA CAASPP coordinators and site coordinators to also take the tutorial. This will also be available very, very soon. All these things are going to be launching. If they're not available yet, they will be soon. And it's required. Every test examiner must complete the test examiner tutorial every year in order to be certified by the school and LEA to administer CAAs. Other things listed here on the slide, there is a resource for students that use eye gaze. So you can review that if you have any students that might need to use eye gaze. And you can also refer to the Start a Test Session Quick Reference Guide created by CDE. Very helpful for new test examiners that have never given one of these tests. It walks them through step by step how to launch a test session in the test delivery system.
And that was recently updated. So.
Oh, good point. Yeah. Okay, that's the end of everything we wanted to present to you all. Now is a chance for us to go through the questions that have been coming in. Feel free to continue sending those questions in to us. And Linda and I here will start reviewing and seeing if we can give you any answers.
So one of the first questions, and I think I responded to it, was will we be providing scores for the science assessment this next year? And yes, we will be. They will be preliminary indicators, but we want to use some caution about using those to make any kind of decisions about a student's performance and comparisons to other students. So use some caution. We do have a web page available. It's the preliminary indicator communication toolkit that provides some frequently asked questions, as well as some guidance for how to interpret, how to use these preliminary indicators. Because we're not finished developing the assessment yet. We're not done with the process of the development. So again, these are preliminary indicators. They are only provided for to give you some sense of where your students stand.
All right, we have a good question here about parent exemptions. The question is, if a parent exempted their student from taking the CAA for Science last year, will they need to be tested this year? The answer is that
Don't read it. That's wrong.
Okay.
So the answer for that question is that for high school, if they're opted out, that's their opportunity. They do not have to get an opt-out for the following year. So if you had a student, a parent fill out an opt-out for the alternate assessment in when they're grade 10, you do not have to fill out another opt-out form in grade 11 or 12. That would be considered their opportunity. And it would be reflected in our data list of students that have been given the test, the reports that are provided in TOMS, that would be indicated in that report that the student received a parent exemption.
All right, and we have a question here about testing at the high school level. Will we be assigned a high school grade level to test just as before? So I'll start to answer, and Linda, jump in here if you've got more to say.
Okay.
But districts have the opportunity to select which high school grade level they wish to test. Remember, it's grade 10, 11, or 12. There are some changes from last year. If those of you who tested last year may remember, every student assigned to grade 12 had to test. This year, they will only have to test in grade 12 if they did not test in grade 11 last year. So now we are really starting the approach where it's one and done, right, Linda? They take it just once in high school.
That's correct. And like I said before, there are reports that you can, the LEA-CAS coordinators can download to determine whether a student has taken the test or not.
All right, next question here. When will the online CAA for test examiner tutorial video be available? And this is a question we're getting regularly. We know you guys are eagerly anticipating getting this critical tool, since it really is, it is the cornerstone for training test examiners. We are putting the final touches on it now, and we do expect to be able to announce it in the very near future, its availability. When it is available, we'll send an email. We'll send a blast email out to all LEA coordinators, so you'll know as soon as it is posted and available that it's there.
Dan, I'm going to let you read the questions.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, next question here. How is it determined which students the district is accountable for testing if the window for CAA Science opens several months earlier than the ELA, Math, and CAST testing window? So to reiterate, eligibility for the CAA for Science is based on the student's IEP. So if the student has been identified to take an alternate assessment by the IEP, then that determines eligibility in the appropriate grades, right? Grade 5, 8, or one of the high school grades. They should be given the embedded PTs at any time from January 8th through the end of the instructional calendar. They need to be registered in TOMS, though we didn't talk a lot about that here. If you're not familiar, we have other resources explaining registration procedures, but once you know a student is eligible to take alternate assessment, they need to be indicated as such in the TOMS system, because they do default to the general assessments in TOMS. You will have to assign a student to take alternate assessments in TOMS, but as soon as you've done that, that student can be given embedded performance tasks anytime after January 8th. Okay, next question. Will larger districts, i.e. With more than 20,000 students, receive a list of all forms that will be used for testing? This would help in the compilation of the materials needed for tests. So I'm going to do my best to interpret this question. So, we mentioned the version assignments earlier. There are 2 versions of every performance task. So it is critical that you look in CAASPP.org at the version assignments. This is similar to what we've been doing over the last few years on the ELA and math tests. You look up the version assignments that are school-specific. They do apply to all grades within that school, and based on that version assignment of 1 or 2, you will download the appropriate DFA from TOMS that's labeled as version 1 or 2. Again, they're also grade and PT specific, but you'll see them all labeled very clearly in TOMS. Yeah, I don't know. Is there any other way to think about that question, Linda?
No, I think that's, sorry.
Maybe I'll take a chance here to also reiterate, the administration planning guides that we talked about, they help you figure out when to administer each embedded performance task, because they tell you exactly which of the science standards, the connectors as they're called for the CAAs, it tells you which standards are being measured by each of the performance tasks. So that helps you work with the people that are shaping curriculum, the instructional calendar, to know exactly when it makes the most sense to give, for example, the life science performance task. You want to figure out when was the life science component of the curriculum being taught. Well, time the testing of that embedded performance task for life science to be shortly after the completion of that instruction.
And one other point I want to bring up is that we're aware that, the time frame in which to administer all 3 of these performance tasks is somewhat compressed. We are going to do our best to have the administration planning guide available for the first operational year sometime in May or June, so you can then start planning your when to administer the assessments using the entire school year.
Good point. Thanks, Linda. We have a question, more of a technical question about this live webcast currently underway. If you had any technical difficulties viewing any part of this webcast, it has been recorded, and we'll post a clean version without any technical issues in 1 week from today, along with the PowerPoint presentation. All right, we have a question about the 45-day expiration. Is the 45-day time limit for an individual performance task for the completion of all 3 PTs? Great question and a great opportunity for us to clarify this. No, that 45-day expiration rule is PT specific, and the clock starts when you first open a PT for a student. So it's not a timer for giving all 3 PTs. You really have the whole time from January 8th through the end of your instructional calendar to give those 3 tasks. They can be spaced out over that entire period. The 45-day clock will start for each PT once it's started. Now, typically, an embedded PT is going to be completed in far fewer than 45 days. It could be just 1 day. It may be an hour. It could be 2 hours. We want you to make that decision based on the student's needs. Maybe it needs to be over a few days, but typically it will not be 45 days. And usually you won't need to be concerned with the 45-day rule. Okay, next question. Is there an overall list of the materials needed for the different versions at each grade level? Great question. We thought a lot about this as we developed the directions for administration. When you look at the DFA, which we talked about a lot here, you'll find that we've tried to organize any materials you may need in a logical way. We've tried to put it in one place. It appears in a few places, but we've tried to put them all listed in one place so you can see a summary of what you may need to prepare. Of course, that depends on a number of factors. The individualization, the needs of each individual student according to the rules for individualization, but we have tried to structure that in the DFA so you can have a summary. Let's see. We had a couple questions on the topic, so that was a good thing for us to reiterate. Just to clarify, does the student need to be asked the first 5 questions to be counted as participating, or just the first? That's a really good question. The short answer is it's just the first question, right? Every student needs to be given an opportunity to orient and engage with each of the 3 embedded performance tasks. So the minimum is that a student must have been given the first orienting activity and the first test question in each of the 3 performance tasks.
Good job, Dan.
Thanks. Got that one right. Okay, so a couple more questions here. How much time do you feel each performance task will take for 8th graders, approximately? Also, is there more to the science test than the 3 performance tasks described? Or is the entire test consist of the 3 performance tasks only?
I don't believe, because we didn't administer the test online last year, we don't have any time data, but because we're using the online test delivery system, that is something that we will be looking at in terms of collecting data on how long it takes students to go through the assessment. Keep moving the...
Yeah, and we got some good thoughts here from our other staff as well here. So, you know, it's really impossible to predict on a student-by-student basis just because of the very wide range of needs of the students that are eligible for this assessment. You know, and the complexity of the questions vary a lot too. So we really can't give you a hard and fast rule about the amount of time for a specific test. That said, you know, we do anticipate that typically you should be looking at, you know, 3 hours, maybe less. But the key point to take away here is that it's going to vary by student. So please give each student, you know, the amount of time they need to complete each embedded performance task. Wait, let me say one more thing here, actually,
Okay.
also. You know, there's less setup required by test examiners typically for these tasks. We've heard your feedback over the last 2 years of piloting about the amount of materials gathering and setup. So we heard you loud and clear, and we did try to reduce the amount of preparation required.
Absolutely. No more bags of sand to get. We've looked at things where we could demonstrate a phenomena through a video, or do we use hands-on activities, and this could be through graphics materials that are provided within the DFA, or gathering materials that are readily available for classroom teachers to be able to pull together and administer the performance task.
Okay, we have a really good question here about testing windows. Must the CAA window overlap with the CAASPP window I have set up for the school? Can CAA testing window have different dates than the CAASPP testing window at our school? So Linda, I think we can collaborate on this one. I'll start by saying, it's a local decision how you schedule your testing. Ultimately, it's up to districts and schools to work out a schedule that works for you. What we want to emphasize is that we want to maximize the flexibility of the administration of CAA for science performance tasks to best integrate with science instruction for the students being tested.
That's absolutely correct. That is our main goal, is to embed the performance task within instruction. That being said, a lot of people last year administered the assessment within a 2-week period, and that was not part of the intent or goal. So you can use the entire January 8th through the end of your instructional calendar to administer the 3 performance tests. You do not need to administer these 3 tests in your testing window that you would use for CAST, for Smarter Balance, or for the CAA for ELA and math. Okay,
we have a question about the test examiner tutorial. Will the CAA for science be part of the CAA ELA and math tutorial training that the test examiners took in the previous years? They get a certificate of completion once they finish the training tool. Great question. Yes, it will be integrated into a single training module. There are separate components. We've configured the online training module to allow test examiners to do the ELA and math piece, or the science piece, or both. And you're absolutely right. It does constitute the core training for test examiners, and it does generate a certificate of completion once a teacher has completed that, which then permits the district to set them up as a test examiner and give CAA assessments to students. All right, another question here. The tracking function sounds useful, but we plan on being done by April 17th. Any chance it could come out earlier? Oh, and I think you're referring to the downloadable report that Linda talked about from Tom's. We wish we could have it earlier, and I apologize we don't have that available from the very beginning.
It will be available April 1st is the plan, so it will be available prior to when you plan on being done on April 17th.
Oh, good point. So at least you'll have those couple weeks to catch up and make sure all your students are done by April 17th. In future years, we'll have this rolled out at the very beginning, so you have it, from the very start of testing.
So I think we're done for now. I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lots of questions. We will be responding to your questions. And Dan?
Yeah, and just a couple closing words. Please reach out to the California Technical Assistance Center, or CalTAC, for all your support needs related to the CAA for Science or anything CAASPP related. We hope you've enjoyed this webcast. We hope it's been useful. And please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. And we wish you the best of luck administering CAA for Science this year.
Absolutely. Good luck. Thank you.